Hello. I'll try and turn my brightness up a little bit. I'm sorry, I'm in a dark room, but this is chapter 11, George W. Bush's quest for realignment. So basically this chapter looked at the United States from about the year 2000, 2001 until about 2008, 2009. So the chapter objectives, a lot of them look into what the ideals of Bush was and the conservative and Republican parties at the time, understanding what launched us into the war in Iraq, um, the country's um, response to Hurricane Katrina, um, and how all of that led to different policies that were created. The political context. So we're in the early 2000s and we're post 9/11 America. So 9/11 dramatically reshaped national priorities and national culture. National security became a top concern, influencing budget allocations and political rhetoric. We also see a resurgence in patriotism, giving Bush political capital to pursue broader conservative reforms. So during this time, we start to see a lot of social stigmatization and stereotypes of those from the Middle East, and saying that they're just going to start another terrorist attack. So we start to see minority groups get more traction from the white supreme of the United States. The political climate, so the Republicans were in charge of both Congress and the presidency. Um, so that enabled a major pursuit of any kind of Republican ideals and policies in which they wanted to put on the chopping block because they were the ones in charge and that were signing all of the bills. Um, so Neoconservative ideology gained momentum, promoting strong national defense, deregulation, and free market solutions, which a lot of our conservative peers today align with that idea. The public sentiment, heightened nationalism and security concerns influencing policy priorities. So the Bush administration aimed to quote unquote realign government by reducing the role of federal programs and welfare, which we see in some of the cases like, okay, whatever, other times it really messed things up. Um, So, the idea of compassionate conservatism really gained a lot of traction during this time. I would say after about the 1950s and 1960s, once we started seeing individuals with special needs receiving adequate care, we essentially stopped, we didn't stop seeing, but we did not see as much private and faith-based initiatives to assist members of society. So instead, the Bush administration promoted compassionate conservatism, helping and leading the homeless, special needs, women, abused children, etc., to private and faith-based, like churches, for example, viewed as they viewed traditional welfare programs as ineffective in fostering dependency. So the whole ideal was to no longer be dependent on your government and to do things on your own. Um, so just a second ago, I was talking about the faith-based initiatives with promoting religious organizations involvement in social services. So there was actually an office of community relations in 2001. The goal of that was to encourage more religious and community organizations to deliver social services. They wanted to level the playing field so religious groups could obtain federal funding without compromising their faith-based identity. So, like, let's say the Catholic Church, for example. Um, they do not receive money from federally funded groups, but if they are supporting the people with them and surrounding them in their community, then they can take that kind of money from the government. There were a lot of tax cuts. Um, they were aimed at stimulating the economy, but I can't say that really worked. We had large scale tax reductions in 2001 and 2003. It was promoted as a way to stimulate economic growth and increase individual choice. Um, it's shifted public resources away from public programs and towards military spending and individual wealth retention because, again, at the time we had just thrown ourselves into a new war with Iraq and a war on terrorism. Um, People who made a lot of money loved it. People who were middle class and below were not a fan because they depended on these social welfare programs in which the funding was taken from. We also see some reform in Social Security. Um, we look into some privatization of Social Security. So Bush proposed allowing workers to divert part of their Social Security taxes into private investment accounts. There was a lot of opposition from the Democrats, AARP, and the public who feared privatization of a core safety net because things that were private initially, we like Americans just don't have a good background of working with programs like that. The reform failed to gain congressional approval and it was ultimately abandoned. Um, Also a big thing that we had was the No Child Left Behind, um, which I still think is intact today. Even though it's not a welfare policy, the law had major implications for children in low-income families. It emphasized things like standardized testing, accountability, and performance-based funding. So the schools that are doing well and have a higher graduation rate, students get higher scores on standardized testing, will get more funding compared to a school where you have a 60% graduation rate. Um, Critics argued that it disproportionately funded underfunded schools and ignored root causes of educational inequality, which is very true because, again, the schools that are performing better are getting better teachers who went to better schools and are more qualified compared to places, let's say, in a rural county where a parent decides to get a teaching certification because there's a lack of teachers. Impact on social welfare. So the shift towards privatization, faith-based services and Social Security reform proposals emphasize private and nonprofit sector responsibility over government intervention. So during this time, we're seeing everywhere go away from wanting to work with the government, and just focusing on its own people, its own communities. It reflects a broader ideological shift toward market-based solutions and individual responsibility for addressing poverty. So the idea of like, why don't you just get up and work from this time? It weakened the federal role in guaranteeing a social safety net, and there was more dependence on charitable and religious organizations. Um, there was a reduced federal oversight, so the delegations and responsibilities went to the states and private entities instead. Massive tax cuts reduced federal revenue, leading to budget constraints on existing welfare programs. Programs like TANF and Medicaid faced increased pressure at a state level due to limited federal support, which we're seeing today. States were expected to do more with less, resulting in inconsistencies and cutbacks in services across the country. Looking at a state like North Carolina, where most of our population centers are in the center of the Piedmont, so you have the Triangle and you have Charlotte. After that, once you get even up into Boone and like you pass through Gastonia the entire way up to 321, all of those are very rural schools. And the kind of education that I had is considerably different than many of my friends who went to school in more rural counties. Um, sorry. Um, critics, critiques regarding increased inequality and reduced safety nets for vulnerable populations. So, again, we're seeing the rich stay rich and the poor stay poor. The idea of generational poverty is something that's really strongly studied during this time period because we're seeing how when we do not have the social programs in place in order to assist people with being impoverished or being homeless, it actually increases the amount of homelessness and poverty that we have, instead of the idea of everyone works for themselves and we all have money, because that's just not true. Lower income families often did not see increased access to resources even as the economy grew. So again, I will always hark on rural communities as someone who has worked in one. Um, Lower income families, some of them up here today still don't have access to clean running drinking water, don't have access to electricity, don't have access to 3 warm meals a day. So utilizing social programs where they can go somewhere and take a hot shower, they can go somewhere and have a hot meal. They know that their children, like their children are being taken care of through childcare. All of those things are very important to get yourself out of poverty. And when lower income families were not receiving those, they were instead digging themselves further in. Um, left vulnerable populations fewer guaranteed supports, especially those not connected to religious or community aid. So, people who, let's say, are atheist or agnostic, or even those who are Muslim at the time of this chapter, really struggled to find that kind of community aid because they weren't affiliated with Judaism or Christianity, where there was so much charity occurring. Um, haha. There was a greater need and demand for social workers within this time period. As federal support diminished, social workers had to advocate more openly and apparently for vulnerable populations because, again, people were thinking of themselves. There was an emphasis on macro level practice, which was engaging in policy reform, lobbying, and educating the public, because a lot of what we were getting from the government was not necessarily what we needed to be hearing as a nation. Um, Jansen stresses the role of social workers as policy practitioners, not just service providers. So social workers of this time were, what's the word? They were necessary to create the policies that we're seeing today. Um, we see service delivery changes. There's a decentralization, so services become more fragmented and inconsistent. Social workers needed to be more resourceful and collaborative, building partnerships with nonprofits, religious organizations, and social agencies to make sure that members from all vulnerable populations were able to receive the kind of help and support that they needed. Um, the ethical considerations, there was an erosion of public trust in the government and welfare programs. That's still something that social workers today are trying to rebuild. They've had to double down on their core values such as social justice, dignity, and worth of person, and importance of human relationships. Um, the chapter reminds us that ongoing civic engagement is essential to uphold and expand the welfare state. Um, so basically, Bush wanted to realign the welfare policy, and they emphasized individual responsibility and market-based solutions, but these solutions only worked for that top 1% of the wealthy. The low-income individuals and families, they reshaped the the structure and policies between government and welfare, which many of these are still debated today, especially around privatization and faith-based involvement. Um, it deepened inequality and limited access for vulnerable population, leaving nonprofits and social workers to fill the gaps. Um, Chapter 11 is a call to action. Social workers must be engaged citizens, ethical practitioners, and policy advocates. We are reminded that political leadership can drastically shift the social service landscape, so we must stay informed and active. Jansen frames social work as both reactive and proactive, responding to clients' needs while also to reform systems that create injustice. And that's it. Thank you.